Hi, welcome to Foreign Entanglements on Blogging Heads. I'm Matt Duss of the Center for American Progress, and with me today is Helle of the Heritage Foundation. Helle, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, you're welcome, Matt. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks again. Glad to have you here for the first time on Blogging Heads. So, Helle, you wrote last week for the Heritage blog. We'll have a link to that piece on the side of this video. You responded to a piece that I had written in Salon magazine, salon.com, pushing back on some of the the calls for war with Iran, striking Iran, and kind of calling out some of the claims for how easy such a strike would be, or that it would be even wise. So if you just go ahead and describe your response to that piece and some of the issues you had with it.
Great, yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Yes, some of the issues I had were, first of all, that the piece that you were pushing back on yourself from Foreign Affairs magazine, written by Matt Kroenig, was the one that kind of set off the debate. That was in the December issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. He was an Obama administration Defense Department official who had left the administration and was now proposing that a military action against Iran is really the only way to stop Iran's nuclear program. So first off, it was the direction from which this whole argument started was certainly not neoconservative, as I thought that your piece suggested. Secondly, you also, in the piece, took the angle that generals and people in the military who know something about how to run military operations have stated that a military attack on Iran is a very difficult thing to do, and it will not be wise. And you quoted them, putting them in contradistinction to the kind of warmongering neoconservatives, a stereotype that's been out there for the last decade. And I thought that some of the quotes that you used seemed rather stale. They were a little old. They were from not from this recent debate for sure. And also that the neoconservatives that you cite, I don't think anyone actually ever said that a military action against Iran was something that was particularly easy or should be underestimated, but that is something that should be looked at, not a cakewalk by any means. And so I thought you kind of put up a straw man and then very elegantly shut it down. But I would rather drag the debate back to a more realistic sense of what people are actually saying, what's actually going on the ground, as opposed to a rhetorical exercise.
Okay, sure. I'd be happy to do that. I mean, first, just to respond to your 2 points. You're right. It was the piece by Matt Kroenig of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was I think a visiting analyst at the Pentagon for about a year or so, that started off this latest wave of discussion about the feasibility or advisability of attacking Iran. But it's by no means the very first piece that did that. I mean, this is something that neoconservatives have in fact been arguing for a long time. I mean, Bill Kristol himself, during the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, advocated in the pages of the Weekly Standard that we should just go all out and make this a war with Iran. Even in the lead up to the Iraq War in 2003, a number of neoconservative advocates of the war were saying that this is the first stop before we go on to Iran. So yes, I think it's fair to say that to question whether Matt Kroenig actually classifies himself or can be classified as a neoconservative, but I think it's very, very clear that the neoconservatives have been advocating this action for a while, and that they've been very involved in this current round of discussions. One of the pieces that I did look at was by Jamie Fly and Gary Schmidt of the Foreign Policy Initiative and the American Enterprise Institute, respectively. Two people who are part of that crowd, and I think in despite what you said, I think those two actually did make an argument. They didn't use the word cakewalk, but they did paint a picture of the the feasibility of just completely demolishing Iran and destroying its ability to function as a state in fairly flowery terms. So, I mean, do you disagree with that?
What I found striking about the piece you wrote was that it linked back to a lot of statements by the people who opposed taking any action on Iran. And I was able to go back and look at those. When it came to the arguments of the so-called neoconservatives, the people you're talking about now, you did not link back to those articles. And I really kind of wish that you had, because I did not have a chance as a reader to go back and say, well, what did they actually say? Arguments made by people like Gary Schmidt and Jamie Fly, whose intellect I have the highest respect for, are sometimes mischaracterized, and I just did not have, I didn't quite understand why you didn't want the reader to go back and take a look at them themselves. So, you're characterizing it now in your words, and I would really rather have a sense of what were their words, because these people are well educated, they are thoughtful, and they certainly have been around the foreign policy issues for a long time.
No, I think that's fine. I mean, I discussed this with Jamie Fly a couple weeks ago on this program. We disagreed on this, obviously. I've got a lot of respect for Jamie, too. So, the articles themselves, I'm actually surprised that they weren't linked in the piece. I thought they were. But in any case, they're very easy to find on the Internet. Getting to the second point about some of the old quotes that were used, Admiral Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I used that just because, when he described some of the, the severe downsides of a strike on Iran, that related to the response from Bill Kristol, who simply described Mullen's views as silly. Quote, silly, and that was kind of the point I was getting at in the piece. If you want more, immediate quotes, we can look to what Chairman Dempsey has just been saying in both when he visited Israel and what he said in testimony on the Hill, just about some of the consequences of an attack on Iran and why now is not the right time.
I obviously can't speak for Bill Kristol, who is eminently capable of speaking for himself. But that one, I was able to go back and look at what he said. And it is true that the word silly was used somewhere in a long argument that he made in rebuttal. Yes, the word was there, but there was a lot of other things involved in the way that he phrased his argument. But to go, to make a distinction here between what was said back in 2006 or 2004 about Iran and what is said today, the situation has changed in Iran. I think we need to look at Iran today. Since the demonstrations of 2009, in which the Iranian people rose up in protest against a government that stole an election from out under them, who demanded through the Green Movement that they be allowed the opportunity to participate in a democratic system of governance, and not the repressive horror that they're living under. I think the situation on the ground has changed to a degree. We do have other things at stake in Iran today beyond oil and nuclear weapons. We also have a deep longing of the Iranian people for freedom, and a longing that has been expressed all through North Africa and the Middle East over the past year. So I think, this is adding another element to the discussion. I think we do need to look at the situation today and to look forward and say, well, what can we do for Iranians? And what is it our obligation to do? We should care. We do care what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Tunisia. That whole region is in turmoil, and it is in the process of change. And we really, need to think about that too, as we're framing our argument.
Oh, I absolutely agree. In fact, thinking about what the Green Movement has asked for and what their actual goals are, I mean, one of the concerns I have with the calls for military action is what effect that, airstrikes by either the United States or Israel on Iran, either on the nuclear program or, as some have called, much more expansive airstrikes, what the impact would be on that movement.
Well, a very valid question. I can't say that I have an answer to that, but it's definitely a valid question. But we do have now the testimonial of the Iranian people that who have become very expert users in social media, internet, cell phone. I mean, they're not silent anymore. And you can go on Twitter, you can follow them. We can follow an internal debate among them, which is very, very interesting. And to simply say that we prefer the status quo, we're going to accept the status quo, when there is from below, from the ground, a sense that things have to change. I cannot predict how they're going to change, and I cannot predict how military action would affect them. But I do know that somehow we should think about that more. We should think about how can we, if Iranians were able to change their regime, we would not have the problem of the nuclear weapons anymore.
Yeah, go ahead.
Then that would be a complete game changer in this entire debate.
Okay, I think there's a couple things about that. First is, I think there is some evidence to suggest that a Green Movement government, or a government on the principles that the Green Movement has espoused, would not be interested in nuclear weapons, even though just for the record, the current Iranian government claims it's not either. There are questions as to whether we should believe that, but they would still. I think the evidence shows that they would still very much support their own right to a nuclear program and to domestic enrichment. But I agree. I mean, if the nature of the government changes, that could very much change our concerns with nuclear power and the nuclear program in Iran. As to the actual I think it's quite right to say that there are a great number of Iranians who want real change in their country. They want an end to the oppression. They want an end to the religious police. They want to live free, secular, liberal lives. Some of them don't. Some of them are much more religiously conservative, just as we have religious conservatives here in the United States. But I think the question is, how much can we do? What can we do to kind of support that natural evolution in Iranian society? I would say that military action would actually work directly against that goal. I mean, this is something I've heard very, very explicitly from people like Akbar Ganji, the dissident journalist, and others in Iran, just saying, listen, if you want to kill the Green Movement, the best thing to do is launch an attack on Iran.
I could not speak to that directly because I just don't know. There are a lot of unknowns in this. A military strike, focused on its nuclear facilities, on Iran's nuclear facilities, would, I cannot say, because I don't know, I'm not a military expert, whether that would kill the Green Movement somehow, and I suspect not. But then I'm not Iranian. I do think that a government of someone like Ahmadinejad, with nuclear capability, with nuclear weapons, have learned the lesson of North Korea, which is to say that having nuclear capability, having nuclear weapons, makes you more secure in your makes you more entrenched, and of course that's what they want to be. They do want to be entrenched, and they are funneling all. I mean, whatever foreign currency they get, through oil sales, through whatever sources, through foreign loans. It all goes directly into the nuclear program. There's no doubt about it. It doesn't benefit Iranians at all. This will be their security guarantee, and clearly that is not in our interest. It's not in our interest that regime persists. No, in the interest of the rest of the Middle East, I would argue.
Well, let's just for the sake of argument, let's just take that as you said it. So I think we're getting at what I think is a real tension here. On the one hand, America's concerns about the future of the Iranian nuclear program, and on the other hand, a desire to see a democratic reform, evolution, or change in Iran. It seems to, and again, yes, we can't really know any of these things for certain, but it seems pretty clear to me from what I've heard to Iranians and others who study Iran, and just looking at the history of sort of attacks by foreign enemies on countries and the effects that has on the way that societies respond, that an attack to deal with the nuclear program would, at the very least, seriously retard Iran's democratic evolution. So that's a tension in the policy. But I just want to get back to like kind of the main point of what we started discussing is, so you had a problem with my highlighting some of the military voices who have warned against the consequences of an attack on Iran. What are some of the military voices that you've seen or are others who've suggested that that it would not create such negative consequences?
Well, in my response to your article, I quoted a report from the Bipartisan Policy Center, which has just been published. It was produced. It's the fourth report in a whole series of reports looking at Iran. And if you look at the members of that group, it goes down the line, both sides of the political aisle. And they argue that, as indeed President Obama himself has said, when you try to put pressure on Iran, we have to have all options on the table. And that group also argues that in order for a military option to be credible, we have at least to make some plans for it. We have to show credibility in the way that we are positioning our assets and whatnot. It is not just the right that is bringing up the topic of military action. It is now something that is rather widely discussed because the Iranian regime has shown itself to be so intractable and so difficult to deal with by any other means. And of course it is also a problem that we do have a problem getting an international consensus on sanctions on Iran. Sanctions that have the real bite that is needed to shut off funding to the regime. And that is why people insist that this option has to remain on the table and has to be continuously part of the debate as we're talking about what to do with Iran. If you're looking at the presidential debates, the Republicans debate, this is one foreign policy issue that people keep circling back to. And it really is an issue of great importance for the entire Middle East. We have to keep thinking about it, and I'm not saying that the military option is the only option, not at all. If you look at our publications, we come up with a lot of different proposals. So I think we need to do that. But there is, it is in the mix, and it's not just on the right.
No, it's not just on the right. I think you've got some conservative Democrats as well, but I would not by any means describe it as a consensus position. There are always going to be people for whom I think military action is kind of like this magical key that you can solve problems. But one of the concerns I had with the current calls for using the military option against Iran is that they seem to just completely disregard the lessons we've got from Iraq, in which, A, we were told there were weapons of mass destruction, and B, that we could solve this problem using our considerable military might, and it just didn't work out that way. I mean, the last 10 years, if anything, should have taught us a very, very important lesson about unintended consequences. And it's very concerning to me that a lot of the very same people who advocated that policy, which I think was just an enormous debacle for American policy and American security, now they're calling for us to do it again.
Well, it is a free country.
Of course.
We all have the ability to express our opinions.
Absolutely, I'm not.
And thank goodness for that.
I'm not denying that at all. I'm just saying that, okay, given that we've got a very real world test of some of these theories about the capacity of U.S. military power to create certain outcomes, I think the onus is very, very much on the advocates of military action to describe how the use of the military to solve the Iranian nuclear problem actually works, and no one has come close to doing that.
I think actually, I think you're right on that. I think it is a very, very difficult issue, in part because Iran has become an absolute expert at using the technologies that were invented by the North Koreans for burying things miles underground. Yes, nobody, and I really don't think anybody argues that this is easy, or would be easy at all. But the question again comes back to what, in some way, what is the price of doing nothing, and we got to look at that too as we look into the future. You can look at different scenarios, and one scenario is the price of doing nothing, and I think we kind of all wish that back in 1935, people had or was it 38? People had a crystal ball that could show them what would happen if they did nothing. So therefore, people do press and they do talk, and unlike Iran, we, thank God, have this free exchange of views on it, and many of the people that you have now described as being kind of hawks in this issue are actually not in the government at this time.
Yes, that's very important.
Exception of Mr. Kronig, who spent some time in the government, and the moment he came out, started writing about military options.
No, but
maybe because he was kind of distressed by what he saw while he was at the Pentagon. I don't know.
Two things. Would you actually describe the president's policy of the last 3 years as doing nothing on Iran?
It's coming pretty close. Listen, another article in the Salon series kind of attacked President Obama for not going the route of engagement further than he did. We all remember how he, in the presidential debate, I'm sure in the exchange he later regretted, talked about how he would, give them his outstretched hand, and if they could unclench their fist, he would work with them, and he would talk to anybody who would talk to him. And it just turned out they didn't want to talk to him. They didn't want to talk to us.
Right.
They certainly don't want to talk to anybody who's a friend of Israel.
Right, I think, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
So that engagement policy is a very short one-way street. It ends the moment you stop talking yourself. Now, certainly the Obama administration, I do think, to their credit, after the crackdown in 2009, when they failed to support the democratic movement to the extent that they really should have, I think they did turn. They did pivot the following January and took a harder line, and now we do see tougher sanctions, and they will be felt by Iran. Iran is making more noise. And so, yes, they are tightening the screw somewhat. But they set off, marching off in the wrong direction.
The policy...
and looking rather silly, if I could borrow a word from Crystal, looking rather silly.
But, the policy as it's gone has been... If you go back to what as a candidate, Senator Obama described his policy with Iran would be, that's basically what he's done. In a debate with John McCain in 2008, he said, if talks with Iran don't work, then we've actually made a greater case for international cooperation and pressure by demonstrating that Iran is the recalcitrant party. And that is, in fact, what's happened. The engagement effort, while it did not produce an agreement, it has contributed to greater international consensus and a far greater willingness on the part of the international community to work together with with multilateral sanctions that Iran is very, very much noticing and is trying to get out from. So, I mean, I think the question, there's still a question as to whether these biting sanctions will actually change Iran's calculus in regard to its nuclear program. But I don't think it's correct to say that engagement simply failed and then they tried something else. I think engagement actually helped contribute to the actual larger pressure policy. And I would just come back to, your comparison of Germany in the 1930s. I think this comparison is way overused. But I think the comparison of that to now is it's inappropriate for a whole lot of ways. I mean, imagine if you had an international coalition to pressure Germany in the 1930s. I mean, it's almost night and day to what we have right now.
Well, I wish that we had back in the 1930s, certainly, and we didn't. But the point I wanted to make with that comparison, and I agree, it is somewhat overused, but it is the primary example of disastrous appeasement in the 20th century. So we keep coming back to Munich. I mean, when in your article, when you wrote about engagement policy, well, maybe you didn't write it. Maybe that was someone else who did that in your series there in Salon magazine. But when you look at Iran, and warn against the dangers of military action, well, what do you want to substitute? What is on your plate? How do you want to make the situation better? Because honestly, the danger signals of Iran's support for terrorism, Iran's outreach to countries increasingly close to our borders, where Iran has a real campaign for international reach, for collaborating with countries who are definitely not our friends. Iran has regional ambitions in the Middle East, and with the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, increasing clout. I mean, Iran is a factor that we have to be concerned about. It is not, as President Obama said in one of the debates, and I'm sure later regretted, it's to be a small country that's a threat to no one, or not to us at least. So why do we care? What do you propose? No,
it's a great question. I mean, I don't deny, and this is the problem I have with people who support military action often accuse us who oppose it of appeasement. I think the policy I've supported. The president's policy over the last few years, I mean, to call it appeasement simply indicates a lack of understanding of what that word actually means. So, I mean, I would support the continued, pressure that is being put in terms of sanctions. I think it's considerable. I think that the administration actually needs to put a little bit more effort toward finding some way of building, at the very least, a line of communication with Iran. Even if we're unable to build any trust, some line of communication that would enable, that would prevent whatever a crisis on the high seas or some other conflict, smaller conflict, from spiraling out of control into a larger conflagration. I think more pressure needs to be put on the human rights front. I wrote in support of and was very, very proud of when the Obama administration successfully supported the creation of a special UN human rights monitor for Iran. I think that was a very important step. That is something that Iranian Democrats and human rights activists have been calling for some time, attacking or criticizing the Iranian government on grounds that it is very, very sensitive on, unlike the nuclear program, which they feel that they have a lot of popular support on. The human rights issue is one in which they are very uncomfortable talking about on the international stage. But again, this does get, we have to ask, will any of this or all of this together change Iran's calculus in regard to its nuclear program, whether it decides to go for a weapon which our intelligence services believe they have not decided yet, or whether they simply just come up to, sort of the finish line and have a nuclear capability. I think there are, obviously, it's not an optimal outcome. It could create some difficult tensions in a region that's already filled with difficult tensions. But when I do the calculus of a nuclear-capable Iran versus an Iran that's just been attacked by either the United States and Israel, in which case, in a few years, we'll end up with the same problem, I think, of a nuclear-capable Iran, or an Iran that is even more determined to obtain a nuclear capability. That math just doesn't work out for me in favor of a military attack.
You know, the Israeli attack on Iraq in the early 1980s on the nuclear reactor was certainly very widely criticized. And yet, it did set the Iraqi nuclear program so far back that it never really recovered, as far as we could tell from what we found when we engaged militarily there. And that you know, people at the time were saying very similar things, and yet it certainly changed the equation on the ground. You know, as I said, I find it hard to predict these things myself as well. But you know, the nuclear proliferation has been a cause for so many people ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Including President Obama.
Including President Obama. You know, nuclear proliferation is considered a huge problem, a threat to world stability. And yet, when it comes to Iran, somehow Iran, with its regime of mad mullahs and its persecution on anybody who opposes them or criticizes them or even snickers at a joke about them, I mean, somehow that then is not such a big problem.
No, I don't think anyone's denying that it's a big problem.
So you know, I think when we look at countries like that, that is when we should take nuclear proliferation really, really seriously, and we have to keep. I am not sure that I'm not sure you're right. To be precise, that on the other hand, I haven't formulated my thinking 100% on the military strike either. So I think that equation is something that we have to look at very closely, and I do think that the consequences of an Iran with its present regime with nuclear weapons is something that really should make us sleepless at night.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Helle Dale, for talking to me. I really appreciate your time. Hope we can do this again.
Hey, you're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.